Hi, Vishnu.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Vishnu Ajay, one of the coordinators of EML, and I welcome you all to the next lecture in the EML webinar series 2021-22. EML is a flagship lecture series of IIT Madras that conducts year-long lectures and interviews with distinguished speakers from various domains, including media, sports, administration, literature, politics, among others. In the past, we proudly hosted the likes of Kailash Satyarthi, His Holiness Dalai Lama, Venkaiah Naidu, Indira Nooyi, and A.R. Rahman, to name a few. To continue this grand legacy, I wish to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian. Krishnamurthy Venkata Subramanian is an Indian economist who is currently the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India and a leading expert on economic policy, banking, and corporate governance. He is also a professor at the Indian School of Business and was awarded the Professor of the Year award in 2019 for the same. Having done his undergraduate degree at IIT Kanpur, he then proceeded to secure an MBA and then a PhD in financial economics from the Chicago Booth School of Business under the supervision of Luigi Zingales and Raghuram Rajan. His work with the Reserve Bank, SEBI, and other private establishments like JP Morgan, ICICI, and Tata Consultancy. Sir, we are honored to have you here with us today. Let's start with the questions. You are an alumnus of IIT Kanpur. After your bachelor's degree in electrical engineering, you diverted into economics and finance. Interestingly, some other leading economists of your generation like Raghuram Rajan and Mural Acharya also followed a similar path. Did you have an inclination towards this discipline of economics early on? As someone who still holds on to the memories of their college days, how instrumental do you think these institutes were in shaping you?
First, thank you very much for inviting me to share my thoughts. So, I'll be honest, when I went into IIT, becoming an economist was certainly not one of the objectives. It just transpired. I did take classes in economics at IIT Kanpur. IIT Kanpur that way was distinctive in the sense that we had to take humanities courses. I think, if I remember right, mandatories, either 4 or 6 courses in the humanities had to be taken. And in that, I think IIT Kanpur was distinctive. And I remember taking courses in economics as well. Did find it interesting. But the reason I ended up, moving towards economics actually was not as much wanting to do economics per se, as I did not quite like engineering, to be honest. Like many people in our generation, because I liked maths and physics, ended up going into engineering, but then found that that was not really as much my passion. And then found that, spoke to a few professors at that time, especially there was this professor of mathematics who helped. He said that, you're quite articulate and you're also good at mathematics. So finance, and business, especially in finance, may be something that may interest you. And so that's how I ended up getting interested, and, then went to IIM Calcutta. And from there, from IIM Calcutta, that's when actually really my sort of passion for research started, surfacing. There was a very, very, good mentor, and, a very famous researcher, S.L. Bhatnagar awardee by the name Rahul Mukherjee, Professor Rahul Mukherjee. He played a very, influential role in me, going towards research. But I remember him around, I think in the second year or so, saying that don't waste your talent by, not going to academia, was sort of the, and I think that played a very important role in, so I did join, ICICI's derivative research group, just to understand what research was all about. Worked for a couple of years there, and then, went for a PhD. So that's how things transpired. I don't think, even with hindsight, I will not say that I planned any of this, over a 25-year period. It's just a lot of serendipity happened, I think, and here I am, really, really privileged.
Our next question is, one of the most agonizing images related to the current pandemic was that of the migrant laborers. Even as India moves forward in many aspects of the economy and employment in the past decades, the fact that 93% of the employed are still in the unorganized sector is astonishing. Do you think this is actually detrimental to the economy or the welfare of the people? If yes, what is the way out of this worry?
So I think this will take us into a very, sort of a longish discussion on, the various reforms that have been done by the government, and also, about the slowdown in the economy before the pandemic. Let me, sort of keep it short. I think one can speak, I can speak about that for just this thing for the next hour, and hopefully keep you engaged. But instead, I'll keep it very short. See, the slowdown in the economy, before the pandemic was primarily because of the financial sector problems that were a legacy of the severe mismanagement of the banking sector, and the widespread crony lending that happened before 2014. I think there's enough been written about that. But what is important to understand is that unlike problems that originate in the real sector, for instance, the COVID crisis is an example of that. When problems originate in the financial sector, and the global financial crisis is an example of such a crisis, the overhang that is created on the economy is much longer. The reason for that is that typically loans, bank loans, or even bank loans to corporates or to individuals typically have at least a 5 to 6 year maturity. And you don't know, whether the loan that was given was to a crony, was it actually, bad loan or not, till it does not come up for maturity, for repayment. And when it comes for repayment as well, because of the severe mismanagement, governance gets impacted, and the banks then have the incentive to evergreen those loans. Evergreening is basically giving another loan to sort of cover up for the lack of repayment on the current loan. And they also end up lending to these zombies, because if a borrower is not repaying, clearly either the borrower is a willful defaulter, or is in significant distress, so does not have enough investment projects, etc. So that's why the crisis that happens, that originates in the financial sector is usually a much more elongated one. The overhang lasts a long time, and that is what actually led to the slowdown before the pandemic. Some commentators say it happened because of demonetization and GST. The evidence does not support that. There's a paper by the current chief economist of the IMF, Geeta Gopinath, in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, where they don't find any impact on growth, at the macro level, during the time of demonetization and GST implementation. So the evidence clearly, in contrast, we provided very careful evidence in the economics 2020 economic survey, showing that the slowdown was because of the financial sector problems that originated from the crony lending. So that's point number one. That relates to that. So when the economy slows down, job creation, it slows down, job creation is impacted. So that's the first point. Second, it is important to understand why this sort of migrant, labor reverse migration happened. See, despite 70 odd years of independence, there was very little done for migrant workers, in the sense that if you have, let's say, if there is in your hostels, maybe if there are some people who are working from Orissa, maybe, or Bihar, etc., you may be having people who are working from there. Now, suppose if there is that worker actually where in his native place, he can avail the public distribution system. He or she could avail the public distribution system in their native place. But, living in Chennai, for instance, they couldn't avail that. And when the pandemic struck, by far the biggest part was about, essentials, being able to actually take care of food and some basic necessities. And because there was no portability of the ration card, you couldn't walk into a PDS shop in Chennai, even though you are a resident of Orissa or Bihar or West Bengal, and say, give me the food that I'm entitled to as part of the PDS system. So that's why a lot of the reverse migration happened. For instance, if you see people who were in rural areas, they availed the Manrega MNREGA scheme. That was the other possible motivator as well. So now what has been done as part of policy is that we've brought in the one nation, one ration card scheme, the portability, and that enables the significant risk on essential items to be taken care of. So even if there is a migrant worker, who is from any other state, but working in Chennai, he or she can avail the, the food stuff. So that's one of the key risks that led to the reverse migration, and, which the risk of which actually has been taken care of. But at the same time, the other thing that is being done is that, if you look at the migrant labor, a large section of these are people, they work on construction sites. Construction activity, therefore, is a very important, contributor to jobs in the informal sector. And the government is pushing significantly on capital expenditures and infrastructure activity, which will definitely enable a construction sector activity and create jobs in the for these migrant labor. Last point, and which was actually a bigger question that you raised, which is why is it that we have so much workforce in the unorganized sector? That's because in the last so many years, 70 odd years, close to 70 years, there's been very little effort put on formalization of the economy. It's only under this government, starting with the demonetization, GST, then the IBC, for instance, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, now labor reforms, the farm bills. These are all efforts at trying to formalize the economy, and that is very important because there are two key features that we have to understand. Not only is it the case that wages are lower in the unorganized sector than the wages in the organized sector. More importantly, the standard deviation of wages. You're all engineers, and so I'll use technical terms here. Actually, stuff that you all will be familiar with. So variance or standard deviation of wages, which is the second moment. The first moment is, of course, the mean. The mean itself is lower in the unorganized sector compared to the organized sector, but the standard deviation, which is actually uncertainty, which is a proxy for uncertainty in earnings, that is even higher, and that is a bigger problem. So, but there had been very little efforts, put on formalization of the workforce. But since 2014, there's been a lot of effort, and it's actually showing impact on the ground. Now, if you look at the periodic labor force service, periodic labor force survey data, formalization, especially in the form of people who are salaried workers, has increased by several crores now. If you take 2012 versus 2018, the data. Similarly, people self-employed, who work for themselves, actually not as unpaid labor, but as actually people who are, sort of working self-employed plus, that has also increased. And casual labor has decreased significantly, and that is because of the policy measures, the efforts that have been taken, under this government. We've had a very long period where slogans like "Garibi Hatao" have actually been given, but it has been only sloganeering without actually real work on fixing those problems. I think Now India has really over the last, I think, 5-6 years, years, there's real work happening on these aspects, because I think what you have to understand is the essential difference is between giving loaves of fish to people versus teaching them to fish for themselves. The political economy has been such that that those that have been in power for a large period of time, since independence, have actually found it favorable to keep giving loaves of fish, so that the voting population remains dependent on them. Have not emphasized in teaching people to fish by themselves. I think that is something that that is happening now in this government over the last 6-7 years.
That was quite insightful, sir. Let's move on to the next question. In the decades between 1970 and 1990, there was a significant public discourse on economics from people like Ashok Desai, C. Rangarajan, and Vivek Kelkar. This was also the age of insightful committees and reports on policy issues. Somehow, the level of discourse is absent in contemporary India, where the policies are affected by political loyalties. How would you, as a professor and economist yourself, encourage the students to make tangible contributions towards development and public policy? How do they upskill themselves to take up this task?
Firstly, it's Vijay Kelkar. Let me correct. Your first part of the question leaves me very baffled. If anything, since 1990s, and if ever in recent times, the debate on on development has actually been far more, has been much higher quality. In fact, if you look at the economic surveys that have been written over the last few years, and I'm not including just the ones that I have authored the last 3 years, but even if you include the ones that my predecessor authored, I think there's actually been debate, very high quality economic surveys driven by research, first-rate research, that had been completely absent before that. So I think and the other point is that if in the 1970s to 1990 period was, I think, precisely the period where India did shambolically on its economic models. Shambolic is the word, and I actually use it very deliberately. If you look at the period where India lost out, really, it is starting from the from the 1960s. On so many dimensions. If you look at the East Asian economies, whether it's a Malaysia, whether it's a South Korea, all these economies, they actually raised ahead of us in the 1970s. In fact, the entire sort of even the model of governance and the the deterioration in governance, etc., happened in the in the late 1960s and 1970s. I think up until Lal Bahadur Shastri as the Prime Minister, I think there was virtue, but after that the degradation of institutions and abuse of institutions started in the 1970s. So I'm really very surprised by the statement underlying this question, because if there is a dark period in terms of our economics that I would actually really pin down, it would be the 1970s and the 1980s, 2 decades where we really lost out. If you compare with China, if you compare with the other economies, that is this was the real dark period. Where we had actually, for instance, the marginal tax rate was 97%. I think it was completely devoid of some basic common sense, of common economic sense. Because if you are going to earn 100 rupees and the tax rate is such that you will keep only 3 rupees out of that 100 rupees, it's just a natural tendency then to actually say, I will hide my income. And in fact, the entire black economy actually started at that time. So many, it was I think the 1970s and 1980s was a period of just pure populism, very little action on the economy, economic degradation. The economic thought was was very poor. And I think that is the two-decade period that India really lost out. Let's be very clear on this. So I think this in any fanciful thinking about the 1970s and 80s period about the economy must be completely disbanded. Not only economic degradation, but even institutional degradation happened at that period. During that period, this period of actually chief ministers being removed left, right, and center. Article 356, I think, being abused. The emergency during that period. It's I think such a dark period. In terms of economic performance, I think by far the worst. So please correct whoever has asked this question. I think needs to really look at the data and actually enlighten himself or herself in understanding it correctly, because in fact now we're trying to sort of undo a lot of the damage. And I will actually say, as even the 2004 to 2014 period was actually a continuation of a lot of that same mindset, and which actually again halted growth significantly, on a lot of the reform measures, etc. So I think any hallucination there is of that period, I think must be completely disbanded. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you, sir, for actually changing how we think about that. Now we have a few questions from the audience that they have directly submitted to us. Haricharan asks, what are healthy financial habits that people can adopt that are beneficial to the general public and the economy as well?
I think at its basic, I would say there are two things that, if common people can understand, can, make a big difference to their own lives and to the economy itself. And these are the concepts of what is called a budget constraint, and second is the concept of opportunity cost. I think these are very important for a household or an individual in his own life, but at the same time it is as important for the country as well. Related to that, I think, let me explain something that a lot of people oftentimes end up missing, which is the difference between the micro and the macro, phenomena. It is about this concept in economics about the tragedy of commons. The tragedy of commons is a story that I actually tell using three characters. Those three characters are somebody, everybody, nobody. So if you take traffic snarls that happen, everybody everybody thinks that somebody else should follow the rule, and so nobody follows the rule. If you take global warming, every country thinks that some other country should actually reduce their carbon emissions, and so nobody follows that. If you have project groups, project work, in your projects, everybody thinks that somebody else should do the work, and therefore nobody does the work. This is basically a phenomenon, and there's a canonical example that I give to my students when I teach. It's been almost 3 years since I've taught, but I think the example is still relevant. Think about a village, having a pond where there are fish, so let's say there are the number of households in that village, and the fish in the pond are such that if every household just picks up only one fish a day, the fish will multiply, and it'll be a sustainable equilibrium where everybody will have for the foreseeable future, every family will get one fish. But suppose you go to fish that day, and your mom says that today there are some guests coming, so why don't you break this social contract of just one fish per family, get 2 fish a day, get 2 fish, right? And then, you all enjoy, you actually get, fish curry for, I mean, I'm a vegetarian, so I don't know how it tastes, but let's say that curry made from two fishes tastes better than one fish, let's say. And everybody starts then, so goes to fish, looks left, looks right, saying there is nobody. Okay, let me pick up, two fishes, right? So, so everybody thinks that somebody else should follow that rule of one fish a day, and nobody follows that. So very quickly, what happens is, the fish basically dry up, and there is no, there isn't enough fish for everybody. You have this phenomenon, of this happening in many states. Take Punjab, for instance. Every farmer, pulls out so much water from the, to basically irrigate his, saying that somebody else should actually, just take out only so much water that is sustainable, for the state. And so nobody follows it. You have water table depleting. So phenomena like this, I think, is very important to answer the question that you've asked me. And that's now I get back to this concept of budget constraint and opportunity cost. You are in the state of Tamil Nadu. In Tamil Nadu, actually, there has been this practice of giving out, for instance, televisions as free, grinders, mixer grinders, and, now, let me use that to frame the concept of opportunity cost. That money that is given as, let's say, television set, if that money is instead invested in healthcare, it's the same money that whatever 1,000 crores or maybe 5,000 crores of the state's budget that is spent, let's say, on giving, television sets, instead of that, if healthcare is created, then, it does two things. One, you're not getting it for free. Those who want to enjoy the television work hard to actually save, to buy a television. That is the first thing that happens. There is positive incentive that is created. Secondly, healthcare, which is actually something that, it's a public good, is invested upon. So this is the concept of opportunity cost, that most people, they do not think about the fact that when they are getting a television set, let's say, as a freebie, and keeping the tragedy of commons in mind, that, so every person thinks that I should get the television, everybody thinks that somebody else should not take it, and so everybody, nobody follows that. When you aggregate it at the state level, what happens is you don't have enough money for spending on, on healthcare. And again, a very recent example of this was, a cash transfers of 5,000 rupees being given, but at the same time, the state saying, I don't have any money to do vaccination. Again, an example of course, there is money. It's basically where it is being, where it's when it can be spent on giving out dose, instead the money could have been spent on vaccination as well. This was when during the time when the states were being asked to vaccinate. Actually, of course, now the policy was changed, but I think so. This concept of opportunity cost is something that individuals all of us must understand. Secondly, the concept of budget constraint. Most of us, actually, we all behave as if when it comes to the government, that there is basically an infinite, like an Akshay Patra. The Akshay Patram is supposed to be one where, because you basically, put Akshay there, and then that Akshay there is actually put back, so it never gets finished. But no treasury, whether a state treasury or the union government's treasury, is like an Akshay Patram. It actually, there's a budget constraint to it. I think, so when, for instance, I see this during budget deliberations as well, when industry, everybody wants some concession, now everybody cannot have a concession because there is a budget constraint. When you combine the concept of a budget constraint and that money does not grow on trees with the fact that there is an opportunity cost, when you spend it on things that actually where the bang for the buck is not as high, you lose the opportunity to spend it on, in areas where the bang for the buck is much higher. I will give you a very tangible example. For instance, there is revenue expenditure, there is capital expenditure that the government can do. Revenue expenditure is doles, just giving out doles. Capital expenditure is actually creates assets in the economy, and thereby increases the productive capacity of the economy. Populist, rhetoric is basically giving out doles, doing revenue expenditure. But if the evidence shows that if 100 rupees is invested in revenue expenditure, the economy, gets only between 92 to 98 rupees. In other words, between 2 to 8 rupees is lost, in doing revenue expenditure. While capital expenditure, when the government does 100 rupees of capital expenditure, about 400 odd rupees of, gets added to the economy. So 4 times as much. It's much harder to actually to resist the populist temptation to do the revenue expenditure, and do capital expenditure. But that is exactly what this government has done, incidentally. But I think that is another illustration of the concept of opportunity cost. Because, when we invest our own money, would we ever go and invest our money in a venture where you put 100 rupees and get 92 rupees or 98 rupees? You will never do that, to your own money. In contrast, if you invest 100 and you get 400 rupees, you will definitely go and invest in that venture. So I think, the fiduciary duty of a policymaker, something that we have taken it very seriously, in this government, is to actually treat the taxpayers' money like your own money, and that is the concept of opportunity cost and budget constraint. So I think, both for individuals and for the economy itself, these two concepts are really important to keep in mind. I'll give you one more example actually on, suppose you have on your own individual level how the budget constraint and opportunity cost starts playing. Let's think about it in terms of your, rather than in terms of money, think about time, and time as money. If you spend that, your time, let's say, going and partying in the, every day, versus working on, on working hard on acquiring your skill set, there is a budget constraint, because every day there are only 24 hours. There's a budget constraint, and there's an opportunity cost that if you that 4-5 hours, when you go and you basically, let's say, you drink yourself to glory, and you get up in the morning, next morning, get up with a hangover, and therefore you can't work, you can't work. So there is an opportunity cost again, there. So the concept of budget constraint and opportunity cost plays as much on your own individual life as it plays in the context of the economy as well. So if there are two concepts that I would actually say that are really important for everybody to understand, it is the concept of opportunity cost and budget constraint. And in that, let me mention again, the Prime Minister of the country, has the same 24 hours a day as the person who's actually, who's let's say, doing, less privileged activities. It is how we all utilize that time, and take into account the concept of opportunity cost and the fact that time is finite. There's a budget constraint. That's what makes the difference in terms of whether you become the Prime Minister or achieve, or do you actually just remain mediocre.
Thank you, sir, for suggesting and explaining those two concepts. Our next question comes from Aniket, who asks, what do you think is stopping the labor-intensive manufacturing sector for growing as much as, say, the service sector?
So again, these questions are revealing to me that you all don't read enough news, because these questions, if they had been posed 2 years back, I think the questions would have been relevant. But if you look at the recent data, if you look at the number of new firms that have been created in manufacturing now in the last 2 years, those are actually the number of new firms created is almost 2.5 times as much, in the previous period. And over a 5-year period, the number of new firms created in manufacturing has increased, almost 3 times. This is the latest data, and this has happened because of the many reforms that the government has done, whether it's labor reforms, whether it's the PLI scheme, the change in the MSME definitions. All these have contributed to. So I think this is a question that would have been apt 2 years back, not today.
Yes, sir. Our next question is from Ayush. He asks, is the 2024 target for a $5 trillion economy still possible, considering the adverse impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on the economy?
So I think there are 2 points that one has to keep in mind here. One, across the world, every country's, economic objectives have been impacted by the pandemic. I think, and that is something that we have to acknowledge. I don't think we can actually be in this unreal world where we can pretend as if the pandemic did not happen and therefore hold on to, goals that were set before the pandemic. That's point number one. But point number two, which is, more important, is that the $5 trillion goal actually, goaded us to bring in so many reforms, which we actually have done. And in this aspect, India has been, a positive outlier. No other country has done the kind of reforms that India has done, over the last 2 years, and in pursuit of that $5 trillion goal. So I think, we will definitely, get there, and aided by and accelerated by the significant reforms that have been done in pursuit of that goal.
Thank you for clarifying that, sir. Samyukta Mahesh asks, recently Tamil Nadu experienced petrol prices over 100 rupees per liter for the first time in decades. The prices in other states also show a similar trend. How is the government attempting to curtail this? And in this backdrop, do you think the public should consider electric vehicles as an alternative?
Absolutely. I think, public should indeed consider electric vehicles. If we have to reduce our carbon emissions, both as a country and as a planet itself, I think electric vehicles are incredibly important. And that is why, if you look at not only in India, across the world, the taxes on, on carbon, so the taxes on fuel, petrol and diesel are actually, are high. For instance, if you look at the United Kingdom, Europe, Germany, Japan, South Korea, look at any of these countries, if you look at the overall contribution of tax to the final price that you pay on the petrol pump, almost 60%, and more of the final price is because of this tax. And that is to actually, to incentivize people to move towards more, renewable, energy driven vehicles. So India is no exception in that. The second point I want to make is that, in a market economy, if the crude oil price increases, then obviously the price, at the ground level will increase. And, oil now is actually close to $85.
It's true, sir. $85 a barrel. Subodh Joshi asks, attaching to your previous explanation on the PLI scheme, how will the PLI scheme help generate long-term employment? And what does our past experience say about such initiatives?
What does our past experience say? I think, we've had a longish debate about it. Actually, there have been periods where our past experience has certainly not been inspiring at all, in terms of the implementation. But I think that is why you have to actually take into account, how is the current scheme different from the past schemes? So if you look at the past schemes, a lot of incentives that were given by the government were ones that actually only focused on small firms, without basically encouraging them to grow. So I'll give you an example. Take our labor laws the way it prevailed earlier. If you became, large enough that you have to hire 100 employees or more, then there were a lot of, lot of compliance that you had to do. If you were a firm that had 90 employees, you didn't have to do as much compliance. But if you became a 100-firm employee, you had to do a lot of compliance. Now, what is the perverse incentive that it created? That, let's say I started a firm, I've grown that firm now. I'm close to reaching 95 employees. Rather than growing it beyond 100 and becoming subject to all these compliances, I go and create another firm in my wife's name, and then another firm maybe in my driver's name, and then my Dhobi's name, and maybe in my maid's name, and this, that, and the other. And so instead of having a firm that has actually 1,000 employees, which enjoys benefits from economies of scale, because economies of scale actually reduces your overall costs, Instead, I became a promoter that had 10 firms, each of which was about 95, 98 employees, none of which was enjoying economies of scale. And so the cost of production was very high. And so I could not compete in the global markets. So at its core, therefore, if you trace back the problem, government policies were such that it gave the perverse incentive for firms to remain dwarfs, in other words, small despite actually aging. As a result, the cost of production was very, very high because they didn't benefit from economies of scale. Because the cost of production was very high, they couldn't go and compete in the global markets. Not only that, now you had to actually then increase import tariffs because the cost of production for these firms was so large that in order to actually, if the foreign competition came, actually these foreign firms, because other countries had not created these perverse incentives, the firms were allowed to grow larger and avail economies of scale. They actually were much more competitive. So you had to erect barriers to sort of, and thereby subsidize the inefficient firms. This is how the policy sort of ended up growing. And let me give you the evidence of this. If you take the United States and compare it to India, plot on the x-axis the age of the firm, plot on the y-axis the multiple of employees that is created. So let's say take the base as the number of employees the firm had when it was 5 years old. Take that as your base, and then plot on the y-axis how many employees did it create as it aged. So 100 as the base, let's say, for 5 years. Now do this plot for the US and do it for India. This is a nice paper in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, actually by researchers at Harvard, that actually showed that if you keep the base as 100 of employees when the firm was 5 years old, by the time the firm became 30 years old in the United States, the firm was creating 700 jobs. So from 100, it had actually grown seven times. It was creating 700 jobs. Why? Because the policies were, did not create these perverse incentive for firms to remain small. In India, what was the same piece of evidence? That a firm that was creating 100 jobs when it was 5 years old was creating only 140 jobs on average when it was 30 years old. Think about it actually now. So in other words, 5 times greater creation of job creation by these small firms in the United States compared to India. And why? Because of the really poor policies that were being created before. And basically this thing, small is beautiful. Small is beautiful, but dwarfs are not necessarily beautiful. You have to make a difference between infants and dwarfs. Infants are small now, but they will grow. And nature also, in fact, supports actually, when an infant is supported, the parent takes care of it, right? But not necessarily dwarfs. No parent supports a kid that has not become, self-reliant, even when the child is 30-year-old. Parents take care of their kids until they are 17, 18-year-old, actually, because they are infants, they need support. But that is how actually, so what happened, therefore, is because of such perverse policies, our firms remained small, did not create enough jobs, and could not compete with with globally. We had to erect barriers, thereby preserving the inefficient and subsidizing the inefficient. That is how policy has, and some of this stuff actually continued during the entire socialist era. This is the kind of but now what does the PLI scheme do? PLI scheme is its production linked incentives, which means that you get the incentive only if you grow. You do not get that incentive if you do not grow. So you have to grow at by a certain growth rate during the 5-year period when the PLI scheme is there. So it does not create that perverse incentive to remain small. It creates an incentive for growth. So the policy design actually has been, has gone and examined what is the core problem, and the scheme has been designed in a way to address that core problem. That is why I don't think the same phenomenon that manifested earlier will manifest again.
Thank you for those valuable insights, sir. Our next question is from Shovan. He asks, now that cryptocurrencies are gaining traction around the world, How should India respond to it? Will cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology reinvent the banking system in the country?
See, you have to make a distinction between blockchain and cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency relies on blockchain, but blockchain has applications far, beyond cryptocurrency. Blockchain has applications in several different areas. I say this as somebody who actually, was an engineer, then became an economist. In fact, my BTech thesis was on the application of neural networks to electrical engineering problems. So this is something that I, have interest in. So it's important to understand, therefore, that blockchain has far more applications than cryptocurrency itself. Now, as for cryptocurrency, I think what is important to understand is that, if there is a financial innovation that is a zero-sum game, that creates a zero-sum game, where, let's say, I buy cryptocurrency from you. You are selling that cryptocurrency to me. After I, let's say, buy that cryptocurrency, maybe I buy it at level X when the value is X. And maybe in the next 6 months, the level goes to 3X. So as you can see, that this is a zero-sum game, because if you had not sold that cryptocurrency at the level of X, you would have enjoyed that gain from X to 3X. Instead, when I bought it, I have enjoyed that cryptocurrency. I think what you have to understand, therefore, is to every buy, there is a counter sell. In any financial market, you do not have a buy happening without a sell. And in that context, therefore, it's a zero-sum game. So zero-sum games where actually, let's say, let me give you, not that I'm equating it to gambling, but let's say, you and I, play cards, and in hostel, I'm sure you have these games, right? Where you sit and, and there is money being wagered. You sit basically every weekend, starting Friday night. Let's say you play till Sunday evening, and you just go to your mess, eat food, and come back and actually play cards, right? Now money has changed hands, of course, during that. Your wingmates, maybe somebody might be richer, somebody might be poorer, but collectively in the money in that wing remains the same. Has a productive asset been created during that 2-day period, weekend? Nothing, no productive asset. Just money has changed hands, but aggregate money in the wing and aggregate knowledge in the wing has remained the same. No productive asset has been created. This is an example of actually something that happens when you have, let's say, financial sector transactions that do not create any benefit for the real economy. It is like sitting together and playing cards for 2 days together. Changes the configuration. These are all transfers. It's like transferring something from the left hand to the right hand. That's why I made the distinction between blockchain and its applications versus cryptocurrency. Blockchain, for instance, if it is used for registering real estate transactions, enormous value. It creates a lot of value in the in real estate. It can be used for a lot of other in governance as well, e-governance, enabling e-governance. But cryptocurrency, unless it creates benefits for the real economy, is like it is basically just it's a zero-sum game. Let me contrast it to an innovation which actually has really positive benefits that was created. This is something that happened under this government, the Jan Dhan account. So Jan Dhan account actually is an effort at financial inclusion, again, financial innovation, but which has actually enabled, hitherto really poor and less privileged sections to be able to get, credit. They're able to access bank accounts. So that's an example of an innovation that is really having, benefits for the real economy. So, as an economist, but as a financial economist, I will actually tell you that I support innovations that benefit the real economy. Innovations that are similar to actually, all of you sitting in your wing and just playing cards for 2 days, are not ones that I really am enamored by.
Thank you for explaining that to us, sir. And our final question, Vedant asks, do you think the Indian economy can handle the impacts of the third wave if and when it arises?
Yes, absolutely. So, two, three things. Let me point out, the Ministry of Finance, writes a monthly economic report, under the leadership of the Chief Economic Advisor. So in the June edition of this report, we had actually written about this. We had, we referred to several research articles that were published in Lancet and the British Medical Journal and outlets like that to give, two pieces of evidence, which are very important in this context. First, that if you have been infected, either you got COVID or let's say your near and dear one got COVID and you were asymptomatic, but you, let's say, were in fact infected. And therefore, if there's a test done for presence of antibody in you, seroprevalence test, actually you are positive, let's say. Now, if you have been infected, then the protection that you get from being infected lasts from 6 to 8 months, at least 6 months. That's the first finding, and this was a Lancet study. The second study was that if you have protection from the infection and you get 1 dose of the vaccine, the combination of protection from the infection plus 1 dose of the vaccine is equivalent to 2 doses of the vaccine. Now, keep in mind that the protection that you get from the infection lasts 6 to 8 months. Does not last forever. But the ICMR came up with a seroprevalence study which showed that close to 80% of the of those that had 70% of people had antibodies after the second wave. So based on that, we did projections and said that if India vaccinates gives 70 crore doses by September, then before the festive season, a lot of us would actually, large proportion would have protection. Now, at that time when we actually projected and we said that we can do 70 crore doses, it was regarded as very ambitious, but we now have actually done 85 crore doses. Significantly higher than the 70 crore. Very ambitious projection, but we actually have done much better than that. Why is this important? Because evidence shows that if you get vaccinated, you have protection equivalent to 2 doses. Then likelihood of death is much lower. Likelihood of hospitalization is much lower. Likelihood of ICU admissions is way lower. And even symptomatic, cases also are lower. Asymptomatic cases actually, I think, not as much impact, but all these 4 are quite important. Even people with, with comorbidities, death in people with comorbidities, with fact, once they get 2 doses actually, or protection equivalent to 2 doses, they, the outcome is much lower. So based on this evidence, therefore, and the fact that India actually has already vaccinated 85 crores, we had projected that we projected to vaccinate 70 crore by September, but we've done 85 crore, as I said. We had said that the likelihood of a third wave, a devastating third wave, is low. That's the first point. And I think because these projections that we had made, not only have they transpired, we've done much better than that. I think I continue to maintain that the likelihood of a devastating third wave is low. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is, even if there is a third wave that comes, during the second wave, we've actually demonstrated that we are able to, balance lives and livelihoods, that trade off very well. We've been able to actually take care of, by only imposing restrictions at the state level, we've been able to actually ensure that livelihoods are not as impacted. So I think even if there is a third wave, I think the learnings from the second wave on how to manage, I think will be very, very useful. So I don't think, therefore, the likelihood of the economy being impacted, very, very adversely the probability of that is very low.
Thank you for that very insightful answer, sir. And with that, we come to the end of the lecture. I would like to thank Dr. Krishnamurthy for spending his valuable time with us and giving us insights and answering our questions. I would also like to thank all the viewers who sent their questions for this lecture. Stay tuned to EML because we have an exciting lineup of speakers scheduled for the future.